Lisa had always dreamed of having her own little piece of land. After years of living in tiny apartments with barely enough space for a houseplant, she finally saved enough money to buy a house in Meadowbrook Estates. The neighborhood looked perfect in the brochure. Neat rows of houses with manicured lawns, a community pool, and wide streets perfect for evening walks. What really sold her on the house was the backyard. It was bigger than most in the neighborhood, with rich, dark soil that practically begged for something to grow in it. Lisa had spent her childhood helping her grandmother tend to vegetables and fruit trees, and she missed that connection to the earth. Working at the state agriculture office had only deepened her appreciation for growing things, even if most of her job involved inspections and paperwork rather than actual farming. The day she got her keys, Lisa walked through every room twice, but she spent most of her time in the backyard. The previous owners had installed a simple irrigation system for their flower beds, and Lisa could already picture rows of tomatoes, maybe some peppers, and definitely a small herb garden near the kitchen window. She knew the soil conditions in this area were good. After all, this whole development used to be farmland just 20 years ago. Her first month in Meadowbrook Estates was everything she had hoped for. The neighbors were polite, if a bit distant. The mailman was friendly and always had a smile. Lisa spent her weekends getting the house settled and planning her garden. She researched which vegetables would grow best in the local climate and soil, ordered seeds from her favorite catalog, and even bought a small composting bin to set up in the corner of the yard. The only thing that seemed a bit odd was how uniform everything looked. Every lawn was exactly the same shade of green, cut to exactly the same height. Every mailbox was identical. Even the color of the houses seemed to follow some invisible pattern. But Lisa figured that was just what suburban neighborhoods were like. She had never lived in one before, her first real interaction with the homeowners. Association happened on a Tuesday evening in March. Lisa was outside marking where she wanted to plant her vegetable rows when a man in his 50s walked up her driveway. He was wearing a polo shirt that looked like it had been pressed that morning and carried a clipboard like it was some kind of official badge. "You must be the new resident," he said without introducing himself. "I'm the HOA president. I wanted to welcome you to the community and go over a few important guidelines." Lisa wiped the dirt off her hands and smiled. "Nice to meet you." "I'm Lisa. I love it here already." The man barely acknowledged her greeting. His eyes were scanning her yard, and she could tell he was taking notes on his clipboard. "I noticed you've been doing some modifications to your landscaping. I wanted to make sure you're aware of our community standards." "Oh, I haven't really done anything yet," Lisa said, confused. "I was just planning where to put some vegetables." The man's pen stopped moving and he looked up sharply. "Vegetables? I'm afraid agricultural activities aren't permitted in Meadowbrook Estates. Our covenants are very clear about maintaining the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood." Lisa blinked. "Agricultural activities? I'm talking about a few tomato plants and maybe some lettuce, like a regular garden." "The distinction is irrelevant," the man said, making another note. "Our residents chose this community specifically because of our high standards. Food production, even on a small scale, creates issues with pests, odors, and property values. I'm sure you understand." Actually, Lisa didn't understand at all. She had grown up in neighborhoods where half the houses had vegetable gardens. Her grandmother's street had been lined with fruit trees and garden beds, and it was one of the most beautiful places she had ever lived. But she didn't want to start an argument on her first real conversation with a neighbor. "Could I see a copy of these rules?" she asked politely. "I don't remember reading anything about gardens in the paperwork when I bought the house." The man reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded pamphlet. "All new residents receive this. I assumed your realtor had provided it." His tone suggested that any decent realtor would have, and that Lisa's obviously hadn't. Lisa took the pamphlet and flipped through it quickly. Most of it was about lawn maintenance, acceptable paint colors, and parking regulations. There was a section about commercial activities being prohibited, but nothing that explicitly mentioned personal gardens. "I don't see anything here about vegetable gardens," she said. The man pointed to a paragraph about halfway down page 3. "Right there. No agricultural, commercial, or industrial activities shall be conducted on any residential lot. Vegetable gardening falls under agricultural activities." Lisa read the paragraph twice. It seemed like a stretch to call a few tomato plants an agricultural activity, but she decided not to push the issue tonight. She needed time to think about this and maybe read through all the HOA documents more carefully. "I'll look this over," she said. "Thanks for stopping by." The man nodded curtly and walked back down her driveway, still writing on his clipboard. Lisa watched him go, then looked down at the pamphlet in her hands. Something about the whole interaction felt off, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what. That night, Lisa spread all her home-buying paperwork across her kitchen table. She found the original HOA covenants that had been included in her closing documents. They were written in dense legal language, but after reading through them carefully, she found the section about agricultural activities. It was just as the HOA president had said, but the more she read, the more questions she had. The covenants were dated 2003, but there were several amendments and additions from different years. Some sections referenced agricultural preservation requirements and existing easements, which didn't make sense if all agricultural activities were prohibited. Other sections talked about maintaining the rural character of the community, which seemed to contradict the idea that food plants would somehow damage the neighborhood's aesthetic. Lisa made herself a cup of tea and kept reading. Her job at the state agriculture office involved reviewing exactly these kinds of documents all the time. She knew how to spot inconsistencies and gaps in legal language. The more she read, the more she suspected that these covenants might not be as ironclad as the HOA president seemed to think. But even if the rules were unclear, Lisa didn't want to be the troublemaker neighbor who moved in and immediately started causing problems. Maybe she could find a compromise. Maybe there was a way to have a small garden that would meet whatever standards the community had established. Over the next few days, Lisa drove around Meadowbrook Estates in the evenings, looking more carefully at her neighbors' yards. Every single one was almost identical. The same grass, the same foundation plantings, the same small decorative trees placed in exactly the same spots relative to each house. It was like someone had used a template and applied it to every lot in the development. But as she looked more carefully, Lisa started to notice small differences. One house had roses along the front walkway. Another had a small pond with decorative fish. A few had vegetable gardens tucked discreetly in their backyards, barely visible from the street. Either the rules weren't being enforced equally, or there was more flexibility than the HOA president had led her to believe. Lisa decided to do what she always did when faced with a complex problem. She would research it thoroughly, document everything, and find the facts before making any decisions. After all, that was exactly what she did for a living. Lisa spent the next weekend doing what she did best, digging into the details. She drove to the county courthouse first thing Saturday morning and requested all the public records related to Meadowbrook Estates. The clerk behind the counter looked surprised that someone would want to see subdivision documents from 20 years ago, but she was helpful enough. What Lisa found in those dusty files was fascinating. Meadowbrook Estates hadn't always been a planned community with strict rules about lawn maintenance and identical mailboxes. The land had been owned by the Peterson family for over 60 years. They had grown corn and soybeans on most of it, with a small orchard along the eastern edge where Lisa's house now stood. The really interesting part was what happened when the Peterson family decided to sell. According to the documents, the land had been designated as agricultural preservation land back in 1987. This meant that any development had to maintain certain environmental protections and couldn't completely eliminate the agricultural character of the area. Lisa photocopied everything and spent Sunday afternoon comparing the original development plans with the current HOA rules. There were some serious discrepancies. The original plans showed community garden spaces, fruit trees along the walking paths, and individual lots that were specifically designed to accommodate small-scale food production for personal use. Somehow, between 2003 and now, those provisions had disappeared from the HOA's official rules. Monday morning at work, Lisa found herself thinking about the situation instead of focusing on her usual tasks. She worked as an agricultural compliance inspector, which meant she spent most of her time visiting farms and food production facilities to make sure they were following state and federal regulations. It wasn't the most exciting job in the world, but it had taught her how to read complex legal documents and spot when someone was stretching the truth about what the rules actually said. During her lunch break, Lisa called the county planning office to ask about agricultural preservation requirements. The woman she spoke with was incredibly helpful and seemed genuinely interested in Lisa's questions. "Oh, the old Peterson farm," she said when Lisa mentioned Meadowbrook Estates. "That was one of our first agricultural preservation projects. The family got a nice tax break in exchange for keeping some of the agricultural character when they developed the land." "Is someone trying to tell you that you can't have a garden?" Lisa explained her situation, and the planning office woman laughed. "That's ridiculous. The whole point of agricultural preservation development is to let people maintain some connection to farming, even in suburban areas. I can email you the original preservation agreement if you want to see it." The email arrived within an hour. Lisa printed it out and read it twice during her afternoon coffee break. According to the agreement, Meadowbrook Estates was required to maintain opportunities for small-scale agricultural activities and preserve the rural character through appropriate landscaping and food production. Not only were vegetable gardens allowed, they were actually required as part of the original development agreement. That evening, Lisa decided to try a different approach with her neighbors. Instead of confronting the HOA president directly, she would start by talking to the people who actually lived next door to her. Maybe they could help her understand how things really worked in the neighborhood. Her neighbor to the left was an older woman named Betty, who had lived in Meadowbrook Estates since it was first built. Lisa found her watering flowers in her front yard and struck up a conversation. "I love your roses," Lisa said, admiring the carefully tended flower beds along Betty's front walkway. Betty smiled proudly. "Thank you, dear. I've been working on this garden for 20 years. It took some doing to get it past the HOA, but they eventually came around." "Really? I got the impression that they were pretty strict about landscaping." Betty laughed. "Oh, they like to act like they are, especially our current president. But the truth is, most of the original rules have been, well, let's say they've been interpreted pretty loosely over the years, especially if you know how to work with them." Lisa felt a spark of hope. "What do you mean?" "Well, when I first moved here, I wanted to plant vegetables in my backyard. The HOA said no, just like they probably told you. But I did some research and found out that the original development plan actually encouraged gardens. I presented my case at a board meeting, and they eventually agreed to let me have a small plot as long as it wasn't visible from the street." Betty gestured toward her backyard. "I've been growing tomatoes and peppers back there for 15 years now." The current board members seem to have forgotten about that precedent. This was exactly what Lisa had hoped to hear. "Would you mind if I asked you about the process? I'm hoping to start a small garden myself." Betty invited Lisa into her backyard to see her setup. It was modest but productive. A few raised beds tucked into the corner, a small composting area hidden behind decorative screening, and a neat row of fruit trees along the back fence. "The key," Betty explained, "is documentation. The HOA likes to act like they have absolute authority, but they're actually bound by the same rules as everyone else. You just have to know what those rules really say." Lisa spent an hour in Betty's backyard, learning about everything from soil preparation to HOA politics. Betty had clearly done her homework over the years, and she had kept copies of every document and correspondence related to her garden approval. "The thing you have to understand," Betty said as they looked at her tomato plants, "is that most of the board members don't actually know the rules as well as they pretend to. They rely on intimidation more than legal authority. But if you show up prepared with facts and documentation, they usually back down." Lisa walked home feeling much more confident about her situation. She had the law on her side, she had precedent from other neighbors, and she had a much better understanding of how the HOA actually operated versus how they liked to present themselves. That night, she drafted a letter to the HOA board. She kept it polite but firm, citing the original agricultural preservation agreement, the development plans that showed gardens were not only allowed but encouraged, and Betty's precedent for backyard vegetable growing. She requested permission to install a small garden in her backyard, following the same guidelines that had been approved for other residents. Lisa mailed the letter on Tuesday morning and figured she would hear back within a week or two. What she didn't expect was the HOA president showing up at her door Thursday evening, looking considerably less friendly than he had during their first conversation. "I received your letter," he said without preamble. "I have to say, I'm disappointed that you chose to go this route instead of simply following the community guidelines like everyone else." Lisa had been expecting this reaction. I did follow the guidelines. I researched the actual rules and found that gardens are specifically allowed under the original development agreement. Those old documents are superseded by current HOA policy, he said dismissively. The board has the authority to update and enforce rules as needed to maintain community standards. Actually, Lisa said calmly, HOA rules can't contradict legally binding agreements with the county. The agricultural preservation requirements are part of the deed restrictions for every house in this neighborhood. The man's confident expression faltered slightly. I don't know where you're getting your information, but I can assure you that no agricultural activities are permitted in Meadowbrook Estates. Lisa had brought her documentation to the door with her. She handed him a copy of the county planning office email and the relevant sections of the preservation agreement. This is from the county planning office. They confirmed that small-scale gardens are not only allowed, they're actually required as part of the original development plan. The HOA president took the papers and glanced at them briefly, but Lisa could tell he wasn't really reading them. I'll need to discuss this with the board, he said finally. But I want to be clear that stirring up trouble isn't going to make you popular with your neighbors. After he left, Lisa realized that this was probably going to be more complicated than she had hoped. The HOA president seemed like the kind of person who didn't like being challenged, especially by someone who had done their homework better than he had. But Lisa had dealt with difficult people in her job before. She knew that the key was staying calm, sticking to the facts and never giving them an excuse to claim she was being unreasonable or disruptive. She was confident that she was right about the rules, and she had the documentation to prove it. 2 weeks passed without any response from the HOA board. Lisa decided to interpret their silence as tacit approval and began preparing her backyard for planting. She had waited long enough, and spring was the ideal time to get vegetables started. She spent her weekend carefully marking out a small area in the back corner of her yard, far from the street and barely visible even from her neighbors' windows. Lisa kept everything modest and neat. She ordered raised bed materials and had them delivered on a Saturday morning. By Sunday evening, she had constructed 3 small beds and filled them with quality soil and compost. She planted tomatoes, peppers, lettuce, and herbs, exactly the kind of basic garden that millions of suburban homeowners maintained without any problems. The setup was actually quite attractive. Lisa had chosen cedar raised beds that looked more like landscaping than farming. She added a small trellis for climbing plants and even installed a decorative border around the garden area. Anyone looking at it would see a well-maintained yard feature, not some kind of commercial agricultural operation. For the first week, everything went perfectly. Lisa's seedlings were taking root. The weather was cooperative, and she found herself looking forward to coming home each evening to check on her plants. A few neighbors even complimented her on how nice her backyard looked. Then the letters started arriving. The first one came on a Tuesday, delivered by certified mail. It was from the HOA's legal counsel and contained a lot of official-sounding language about covenant violations and required compliance measures. The basic message was simple. Remove the garden immediately or face escalating enforcement actions. Lisa wasn't surprised, but she was disappointed. She had hoped that once the board saw how reasonable and attractive her garden was, they would recognize that their concerns were unfounded. Instead, they seemed determined to treat this as a battle of wills rather than a matter of following the actual rules. She responded with her own letter, again citing the agricultural preservation requirements and including additional documentation she had requested from the county. She also pointed out that several other residents had similar gardens, and she requested information about why the rules were being enforced selectively. The HOA's response came faster this time. The second letter arrived just 4 days later, and this one was more aggressive. They demanded that Lisa attend a board meeting to discuss her ongoing violations, and warned that failure to comply with HOA regulations could result in liens against her property. Lisa marked the meeting date on her calendar and spent the intervening week preparing her presentation. She had learned a lot about HOA law during her research, and she knew that boards had significant authority, but only within the bounds of their legal agreements and state regulations. They couldn't simply make up rules and enforce them arbitrarily. The night of the board meeting, Lisa arrived at the community center with a folder full of documentation and a calm, professional demeanor. She had given presentations to government officials and agricultural inspectors countless times in her job. This was just another meeting where facts and preparation would determine the outcome. The community center was more crowded than Lisa had expected. Apparently, word had gotten around the neighborhood that there was going to be some kind of confrontation at the board meeting. She recognized several of her neighbors, including Betty, who gave her an encouraging wave from across the room. The HOA president called the meeting to order and immediately launched into a speech about the importance of maintaining community standards and property values. He spent several minutes talking about how certain residents seemed determined to ignore the rules that everyone else followed without complaint. When he finally called Lisa to present her case, she kept her response simple and factual. She had prepared a brief presentation that covered the key points: the Agricultural Preservation Agreement, the original development plans that encouraged gardens, and the precedent of other residents who had been approved for similar projects. The bottom line, Lisa concluded, is that small-scale gardens are not only allowed under our community's governing documents, they're actually required as part of our agreement with the county. The HOA doesn't have the authority to prohibit activities that are mandated by our deed restrictions. The board members spent several minutes whispering among themselves. Lisa could tell that at least two of them were uncomfortable with the president's hardline approach. One woman kept looking at the documents Lisa had provided and shaking her head. Finally, the president spoke up. "Ms. Johnson, while we appreciate your research, the board has a responsibility to interpret our covenants in a way that serves the best interests of all residents. Allowing agricultural activities sets a precedent that could lead to property value degradation and neighborhood deterioration." Lisa had been expecting this argument. With respect, the board doesn't have discretionary authority to ignore deed restrictions that are part of our property titles. These aren't optional guidelines. They're legal requirements that were established when the development was approved. The meeting continued for another hour, with various board members asking questions and several neighbors offering their opinions. Betty spoke up to mention her own garden and the approval process she had gone through years earlier. Two other residents mentioned that they had small vegetable plots and had never been told they were violating any rules. In the end, the board agreed to take the matter under advisement and provide a response within 30 days. Lisa left the meeting feeling cautiously optimistic. The president was clearly unhappy, but the other board members seemed more reasonable once they understood the legal situation. 3 weeks later, Lisa received what she thought would be the board's final decision. Instead, it was another ultimatum. The letter informed her that the board had carefully reviewed her request and determined that her garden constituted a violation of community standards. She had 15 days to remove all vegetable plants or face enforcement action. Lisa was frustrated but not surprised. She had dealt with bureaucratic stubbornness in her job before. Some people were more interested in winning arguments than following rules, and the HOA president seemed to fall into that category. She decided to give them one more chance to resolve this reasonably. Lisa drafted a final letter explaining that she would be happy to work with the board to find a compromise, but that she would not voluntarily remove a garden that was explicitly permitted by the community's governing documents. The response came 10 days later, and it wasn't a letter. Lisa came home from work on a Thursday evening to find her backyard flooded. Water was bubbling up from the ground near her garden beds and streaming across her patio. For a moment, she thought a water main had burst. Then she saw the neat, deliberate cuts in the irrigation lines that fed her garden area. Someone had cut her water pipes. Lisa stood in her soggy backyard, looking at the severed pipes and the muddy water soaking into her lawn, and felt a cold anger settling in her chest. This wasn't just a violation of property rights or HOA overreach. Someone had deliberately damaged her plumbing system, causing flooding that could affect her home's foundation and create expensive repair bills. She took dozens of photos with her phone, documenting the cut pipes, the flooding, and the damage to her garden. Then she called the police to report vandalism of her property. The responding officer was sympathetic, but explained that without witnesses or security camera footage, it would be difficult to prove who was responsible. "You might want to check with your homeowners association," he suggested. "Sometimes they have authority to do maintenance work, but they're supposed to notify residents first." Lisa almost laughed. She had a pretty good idea who was responsible for this maintenance work, and she was quite certain they hadn't followed proper procedures. In fact, She was beginning to suspect they had violated several laws in addition to destroying her property. That night, Lisa sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and began researching municipal codes related to utility service and property damage. She also started documenting everything that had happened over the past 2 months. Every letter, every meeting, every conversation with board members and neighbors. By morning, she had a clear picture of exactly how many laws had been broken when someone cut her water lines. She also had a much better understanding of what her options were for responding to what was clearly an escalation far beyond anything she had expected from a neighborhood dispute about vegetable gardens. What the HOA president didn't know was that Lisa had spent the last 5 years of her career dealing with exactly these kinds of property rights and utility access issues. Her job at the state agriculture office had taught her a lot about water rights, infrastructure regulations, and what happened when people took the law into their own hands. It was time to make some phone calls. Lisa's first call Friday morning was to her supervisor at the state agriculture office. Janet had been Lisa's boss for 3 years, and she'd always encouraged her staff to bring potential regulatory issues to her attention, even when they occurred outside of work. "Someone cut your water lines?" Janet sounded incredulous. "Lisa, that's not just property damage. If they interfered with agricultural water access without proper permits, that could be a state violation, especially on preserved agricultural land." This was exactly what Lisa had hoped to hear. "I was thinking the same thing. The irrigation system serves my garden, which is specifically protected under the Agricultural Preservation Agreement for our development." "Send me everything you have," Janet said. "Photos, documents, correspondence with the HOA. This might be something we need to investigate officially." Lisa's second call was to the county planning office. The same helpful woman who had sent her the preservation agreement was outraged when Lisa explained what had happened. "They did what?" "Lisa, honey, that's completely illegal. HOA or no HOA. You can't just go around cutting people's utility lines. And on agricultural preservation land, that's a whole other level of violation." By the end of the day, Lisa had filed reports with the county planning office, the state agriculture department, and the Municipal Utilities Commission. She had also contacted her homeowner's insurance company and gotten estimates for repairing the damaged irrigation system. The weekend was quiet, which gave Lisa time to think about her next steps. She was no longer dealing with a simple neighborhood dispute about garden rules. Someone had committed what appeared to be several crimes, caused hundreds of dollars in property damage, and potentially violated state and federal regulations related to agricultural preservation land. Monday morning brought the first sign that her complaints were being taken seriously. A county inspector showed up at Lisa's house before she left for work, ready to examine the cut pipes and take his own photographs. "Ma'am, I've been doing this job for 15 years, he told Lisa as he documented the damage. "I've never seen anything like this. HOAs have a lot of authority, but they can't just destroy people's infrastructure. Whoever did this could be facing criminal charges." The inspector took soil samples and water measurements, then asked Lisa to walk him through the timeline of her conflict with the HOA. When she showed him the letters and meeting minutes, he shook his head in disbelief. "They put this in writing? They actually documented their intent to prevent you from using your property for agricultural purposes on agricultural preservation land. Ma'am, I think you might want to consider getting a lawyer." Tuesday brought even more interesting developments. Lisa came home from work to find a certified letter from a law firm she had never heard of. For a moment, she worried that the HOA was escalating their legal threats. Instead, the letter was from an environmental law firm that specialized in agricultural preservation cases. "Ms. Johnson," the letter read, "we understand that you may be experiencing interference with your agricultural land use rights. Our firm handles cases involving HOA overreach on preserved agricultural property. We would be interested in discussing your situation at no charge." Lisa called the number in the letter that evening and spoke with an attorney named David Chen. He explained that his firm had been contacted by the county planning office, which sometimes referred cases involving agricultural preservation violations. "The thing about agricultural preservation land," David explained, "is that the restrictions run with the deed. The HOA can't just decide to ignore them because they don't like vegetables. And cutting someone's agricultural water access? That's potentially a federal crime if it interferes with agricultural use on preserved land. David offered to review Lisa's documentation and provide a free consultation. Lisa agreed to meet with him later in the week. Wednesday morning brought the most surprising development yet. Lisa was in the middle of her usual inspection route when her phone rang. The caller identified himself as an investigator with the State Agriculture Department's Enforcement Division. "Ms. Johnson, we've received your complaint about interference with agricultural activity on preserved land. I'd like to schedule a site visit to examine the damage and interview witnesses. Would this afternoon work for you?" Lisa had filed the complaint herself, but she hadn't expected such a quick response. "Of course."
Can I ask what kind of investigation this involves?
"Well, ma'am, interfering with agricultural water access on preserved land is a serious matter. Depending on what we find, this could result in significant fines and mandatory restoration requirements. We take agricultural preservation very seriously in this state." The investigator arrived at Lisa's house that afternoon with a partner and a truck full of testing equipment. They spent 2 hours documenting everything: the cut pipes, the flooded area, the impact on Lisa's garden, and the broader irrigation system that served the backyard. They also asked detailed questions about the HOA's actions and reviewed all of Lisa's correspondence with the board. "Ms. Johnson," one of the investigators said as they finished up, "I want you to know that this appears to be a clear violation of agricultural preservation statutes. Someone destroyed agricultural infrastructure on protected land without permits, environmental review, or proper notice. This is exactly the kind of case our department was created to handle." Thursday brought a visit from the municipal utilities inspector. Lisa was starting to feel like her backyard was becoming a crime scene, with all the official attention it was receiving. The utilities inspector was particularly interested in who had authorized the work and whether proper permits had been obtained. "Ma'am, cutting into irrigation lines requires permits and inspections, just like any other utility work. If the HOA hired contractors to do this work without proper authorization, that's a municipal code violation. The contractors could lose their licenses, and whoever authorized the work could face fines." The inspector also pointed out something Lisa hadn't considered. "These lines don't just serve your garden. They're connected to the main irrigation system for this whole section of the neighborhood. Cutting them improperly could have affected water pressure and service for your neighbors too." Friday afternoon, Lisa met with David Chen at his law office downtown. She brought copies of everything: HOA correspondence, preservation agreements, inspection reports, and photographs of the damage. David spent an hour reviewing the documents, occasionally making notes or asking questions. Finally, he looked up at Lisa with a serious expression. "Lisa, this is one of the most clear-cut cases of HOA overreach I've seen in 20 years of practice. They violated agricultural preservation law, municipal utility codes, and probably several criminal statutes. The damage to your property is just the beginning." He explained that cases like this often revealed broader problems with HOA management and compliance. "We'll need to examine their other decisions and see if there's a pattern of ignoring legal requirements. HOA boards have significant power, but they're not above the law." David offered to represent Lisa on a contingency basis, meaning she wouldn't pay attorney fees unless they recovered damages from the HOA. He also explained that state agricultural preservation violations often resulted in mandatory restoration requirements and significant fines. "The best part," David said with a slight smile, "is that agricultural preservation violations are handled by state agencies that have real enforcement power. Unlike regular civil disputes, this involves state investigators who can compel cooperation and impose penalties." Lisa left the law office feeling more confident than she had in weeks. She wasn't just dealing with stubborn neighbors anymore. She had state agencies, municipal inspectors, and an experienced attorney on her side. What she didn't realize was that the HOA president was about to discover exactly what kind of person he had chosen to pick a fight with. Lisa's job at the state agriculture office wasn't just about paperwork and inspections. She was part of an enforcement network that took agricultural preservation law very seriously, and she had colleagues throughout state government who were very interested in her case. The HOA was about to learn that cutting someone's water lines was bad enough. But cutting the water lines of a state agriculture official on agricultural preservation land, that was the kind of mistake that could destroy a homeowners association and bankrupt its board members. The following Monday morning, Lisa arrived at work to find her supervisor Janet waiting by her desk with a cup of coffee and a stack of official-looking documents. "Lisa, I've been making some calls about your situation," Janet said, settling into the chair across from Lisa's desk. "It turns out your HOA problem is about to become their HOA nightmare." Janet explained that she had spent the weekend discussing Lisa's case with colleagues throughout the state agriculture department. What had started as a simple property dispute was now being treated as a potential test case for agricultural preservation enforcement. "The thing is," Janet continued, "we've been getting more and more complaints about HOAs interfering with agricultural activities on preserved land. Your case is so well documented and so clearly illegal that it's perfect for establishing precedent." Lisa felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means the state attorney general's office is interested. It means our enforcement division is treating this as a priority case. And it means your HOA is about to get a lot more attention than they bargained for." By Wednesday, the attention became impossible to ignore. Lisa came home from work to find the HOA president waiting in her driveway, but this time he wasn't carrying a clipboard. He looked tired and stressed, and his confident demeanor from their previous encounters had completely disappeared. "Ms. Johnson," he said as Lisa got out of her car, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. The board would like to discuss a resolution to this garden situation." Lisa remained polite but cautious. "What kind of resolution?" "Well, we've been reviewing the preservation agreements you mentioned, and it appears there may be more flexibility in our covenants than we initially realized. The board is prepared to approve your garden project." Lisa almost smiled. After months of being told that gardens were absolutely prohibited, the HOA was suddenly discovering flexibility in their rules. "That's interesting. What changed?" The president shifted uncomfortably. "We've been in communication with various county and state agencies about the recent infrastructure issues. It seems there may have been some miscommunication about proper procedures." This was clearly an understatement. Lisa had heard from David Chen that morning that the HOA was facing potential fines from 3 different agencies, plus a lawsuit from the contractors who had been hired to cut her pipes without proper permits. "I appreciate the board's willingness to reconsider," Lisa said carefully, "but I'm not sure approval for my garden addresses the larger issues at this point." The president's expression became more desperate. "What would it take to resolve this situation? The board is prepared to be very reasonable." Lisa had been thinking about this conversation for days. She knew the HOA was in serious trouble, and she suspected they were hoping to make this problem disappear before it got worse, but too much had happened for a simple apology to be sufficient. "I think you need to talk to my attorney," Lisa said finally. "David Chen at Morrison Environmental Law. He's handling my case now." The president nodded quickly and wrote down the information. As he walked back to his car, Lisa could see him making phone calls before he even reached the street. The next morning brought news that the situation had escalated even further. Janet called Lisa into her office to explain that the state attorney general had decided to launch a formal investigation into HOA interference with agricultural preservation rights. "Lisa, your case started something big. We've received dozens of complaints from other homeowners in similar situations. Apparently, this kind of thing has been happening all over the state, but no one ever had the documentation and legal knowledge to challenge it effectively." The Attorney General's investigation moved quickly. Within 2 weeks, investigators had interviewed HOA board members, contractors, and neighbors throughout Meadowbrook Estates. They had also requested documents from the HOA's attorneys and management company. What they found was worse than Lisa had imagined. The board had a pattern of ignoring legal requirements when they conflicted with their personal preferences. They had denied garden approvals to multiple residents despite clear evidence that such activities were protected. They had hired contractors for maintenance work without proper permits on several occasions. And they had used intimidation tactics to discourage residents from challenging their decisions. David Chen kept Lisa updated on the legal developments. "The Attorney General's office is considering charges against individual board members," he told her during one of their phone conversations. "Destroying infrastructure on preserved agricultural land is a felony in this state, especially when it's done deliberately to prevent legal agricultural activities." The civil lawsuit was proceeding separately. David had filed claims for property damage, violation of Lisa's civil rights, interference with agricultural activities, and violation of agricultural preservation law. The potential damages were significant, especially given the state statutory penalties for agricultural preservation violations. But the most satisfying development came from an unexpected source. Lisa received a call from the county planning office informing her that Meadowbrook Estates was being required to undergo a comprehensive compliance review. Ms. Johnson, the planning officer explained, "When we investigated your complaint, we discovered that your HOA has been operating in violation of their agricultural preservation requirements for years. They're going to be required to bring the entire development into compliance, including establishing the community garden spaces that were supposed to be maintained all along." The compliance review revealed that the HOA had violated numerous provisions of their development agreement. They had removed fruit trees that were supposed to be maintained along the walking paths. They had prohibited composting activities that were specifically encouraged in the original plans. And they had failed to establish the community garden areas that residents were supposed to have access to. The penalties were substantial. The HOA faced fines totaling over $50,000, plus the cost of bringing the development into compliance with agricultural preservation requirements. They would be required to plant new fruit trees, establish community garden spaces, and revise their covenants to explicitly allow the agricultural activities that had always been legally protected. Individual board members faced personal liability for the infrastructure, damage, and civil rights violations. The HOA president, in particular, was looking at potential criminal charges for authorizing the destruction of Lisa's irrigation system. 3 months after her pipes were cut, Lisa received a settlement offer that exceeded her wildest expectations. The HOA's insurance company was eager to resolve the matter before the criminal case went to trial, and they were prepared to pay significant damages to make the problem disappear. David Chen reviewed the settlement terms with Lisa on a sunny Friday afternoon in his office. "They're offering to pay for all repairs and improvements to your property, plus damages for the civil rights violations and lost use of your garden. They'll also revise the HOA covenants to explicitly protect agricultural activities and establish you as the coordinator for the new community garden spaces." Lisa was amazed by how completely the situation had reversed. "What about the criminal charges?" "That's up to the prosecutor. But I suspect the board members will plead guilty and pay fines in exchange for avoiding jail time. The evidence is pretty overwhelming." Lisa signed the settlement agreement, but she made sure it included provisions beyond just financial compensation. The HOA would be required to send a letter to all residents explaining their agricultural rights under the preservation agreement. They would establish educational programs about sustainable gardening and composting, and they would create an agricultural committee with real authority to approve garden projects and other agricultural activities. Most importantly, the settlement included a provision requiring the HOA to maintain detailed records of all decisions and to provide annual reports to the county planning office about their compliance with agricultural preservation requirements. 6 months later, Lisa stood in her backyard admiring her thriving vegetable garden and the newly established community garden area that stretched along the back of the development. Neighbors who had been afraid to challenge the HOA's arbitrary rules were now growing their own vegetables and participating in community composting programs. Betty stopped by one evening while Lisa was harvesting tomatoes. "You know, dear," she said, "I always knew those board members were overstepping their authority, but I never imagined anyone would have the knowledge and persistence to actually do something about it." Lisa smiled as she handed Betty a bag of fresh vegetables. Sometimes it pays to know the rules better than the people who are supposed to be enforcing them. The HOA president had resigned in shame and moved away from the neighborhood. The new board members were much more collaborative and focused on actually following the law, rather than making up rules as they went along. The community was thriving in ways that the original developers had envisioned, but the previous HOA had prevented. Lisa's case had become a model for agricultural preservation enforcement throughout the state. Her documentation and legal strategy were being used to train other agriculture officials about how to handle similar situations. The Attorney General's office had established new protocols for investigating HOA violations of agricultural preservation law. Most importantly, Lisa finally had the garden she had always wanted. along with the satisfaction of knowing that her neighbors now had the same rights and opportunities. The rich soil that had once grown corn and soybeans for the Peterson family was once again producing food, just as the original preservation agreement had intended. As Lisa walked through her garden on warm summer evenings, she often thought about how a simple desire to grow tomatoes had led to such a comprehensive victory for property rights and agricultural preservation. Sometimes the most important battles were fought not with grand gestures, but with careful documentation, persistent research, and the courage to stand up for what was right. The HOA had learned a valuable lesson about the difference between legitimate authority and arbitrary power. And Lisa had learned that being right about the law was even more satisfying when you had the knowledge and resources to prove it.